speaking settings. I mean, ordinarily you put the podium in the center, but now, since everybody does PowerPoint, you put the podium to the side and everybody's focus is not on the speaker but on the PowerPoint. I don't know how to do PowerPoint. I'm too old and I'm not even sure I like it. So I'm glad to be here. Neil reminded me that this speech has been in the making for many years. Actually, in the first 3 of the institutes, I prepared a closing, summarizing speech, some of which I had written in advance before hearing the speaker, some of which I worked on during the time of the conference. And then we came to the end on Saturday morning, and everybody wanted to go home. And so I never gave those speeches. They're sitting somewhere in a variety of files in my office. But this is sort of 7 years in the making. So here's the deal. It's written. There will be hard copies available through EBF later if you wish. But you will also get a 4-page, single-spaced summary of what I'm going to say. But I don't want you to have it now. I want you just to enjoy and listen. And I'm going to try and make a case, and in order to make that case, I'm going to stay fairly close to my little text here. Everybody hearing me okay? Wonderful. Secondly, I hope you will find many connections with what Sherwin Newland said last night in his wonderful presentation. There will be some tweaking that will take, I want to say, will take us in a slightly different direction, but not in opposition to anything that he said last night. And thirdly, this is for all kinds of caregivers. I have in mind, as I wrote this, people who work in hospice, people who do end-of-life care for folk, and it would, I hope, apply to families as well, who are caregivers for those who are at the end of life. One of the intended purposes of this institute, as Neil and I envisioned it a long time ago, was that we would seek to explore the themes of Ernest Becker in order to try and identify implications of Becker's thought for care of the dying. And sometimes that's, through the years, sometimes that's worked better than other times. Most of the main speakers we've invited were people not altogether familiar with Ernest Becker. And so that's what I'm going to try and do this morning. I'm going to try and, in my way, identify some themes in Becker that I think will have implications for our care of the dying. And simply, I want to say that if we take finitude seriously, if we take seriously the reality that not everything is possible, if we take seriously the limits to medical practice and the limits to extending life in any kind of positive way, if we understand human limits, death being, of course, the final of human limits, if we understand them and take them seriously, then I want to argue that faithfulness needs to be added at the core of care alongside compassion and other words that we might use. That is, we need to be very committed to being faithful if we are going to acknowledge the limits of what we can do at the end of life. And I hope that will be clear as we go along. If, as Becker insists, the fear of death is the mainspring of all human activity, then it is no less true of our living near death. How an individual has responded to finitude in general in life will affect how they manage the limits when death is near. It's also true for those of us who are caregivers. For the caregiver, the direct experience of finitude is more about limited time, or the patient's needs, or about the impossible desire to stop the march of an incurable disease. But finitude, as I'm using the term, is a condition of being limited that defines the human situation. Now, for the most part, we take for granted that we are limited, that we are finite in space, that we can't be, although we try and double book sometimes. We can't be in two places at the same time. And we're comfortable with that. We don't rail at the notion that we can't bilocate ourselves. Nor can we fly. But time also limits the creature. And it is a good thing. This talk will not go on forever. There will be a beginning and an end to this talk. Temporal finitude prevents monotony in the world. And provides a rounding off time so that we can see an event or a conference or a life in its totality. And in that sense, finitude is a good thing, even though we rail against it. And sometimes, certainly at the end of life, we regard limitations as invasions or disruptions or some kind of disruption of our life. Occasionally, there are people who take finitude very seriously. Take for example, Malcolm. Malcolm was taking a walk when he saw a frog on the sidewalk. He was startled to hear the frog speak. "Hey, old man," said the frog, "if you kiss me, I will turn into a beautiful princess. I will be yours forever, and we can make mad, passionate love every day." Malcolm picked up the frog, stuck it in his pocket, and kept walking. And the frog said again, "Hey, Malcolm, I don't think you heard me. If you kiss me, I will become a princess and we can make mad, passionate love all day, every day." And Malcolm said, "I heard you. But at my age, I'd rather have a talking frog." Now, that is a wonderful, ordinary illustration of recognizing human limitations in life and making choices accordingly. Life would be a lot simpler, and care of the dying would be a lot easier if we all could be a little more accepting of finitude like Malcolm. You'll get a handout that's a poem about the bee that hits the plate of glass, and I'm going to skip that just for the sake of time, and simply say that we suffer. Generally speaking, we suffer obviously because we're finite creatures. When students ask me, and I've spent my life teaching in theological seminaries and taught my first course on dying and grieving in 1971, and I bought The Denial of Death, just parenthetically. I just looked again at the copy. It was 1975 when I bought the copy, and it is the same book. It's now a little worn and tattered. And I've tried to say over the years to students, we suffer because we're human. And because we're finite human creatures. Now there are other occasions. Sometimes we suffer because of our awareness of finitude prompts us to live in a manner that is negative. Sometimes we suffer because we want to avoid finitude. Paul Tillich, who was Becker's favorite theologian at the end of his life, and Ron Friesen will attest to that later today, made this statement: "Christianity demands that one accept suffering with courage as an element of finitude and affirm finitude in spite of the suffering that accompanies it." So to accept finitude and to accept the suffering that comes with it simply is a consequence of being finite. So it takes courage to live with limits anytime, and particularly when we're dying. So I want to say that faithful care at the end of life depends on everybody consenting to limits. Family, medical staff, nurses, caregivers, chaplains, physicians. Well, it would really be very helpful if we're all on the same page, that human beings are limited, and death is that final limit, but it's unavoidable, and we live with that reality. And when we accept that cure is no longer possible and only care is called for, we need an extra measure of commitment to stay present with someone whose life circumstances cannot be reversed. That's my point. Compassionate care ensures that the helper's response originates from deep within the caregiver and adequately conveys empathy to the patient. So as Sherwin Newland talked about last night, compassionate care is something we need to keep teaching. But I want to suggest that faithfulness comes even before compassion. We have to show up to be compassionate and stay there long enough so that the compassion can have some significance. Faithfulness is more demanding than compassion because it requires one to continue giving even when the empathy well runs dry. So the aim of this talk is to explore the themes of Ernest Becker and how the relationship between finitude and how our understanding of finitude will nuance the care of those living toward death. My first proposal is this, and I've said it already. If we acknowledge finitude and the reality of death in life, and if we admit that not everything is possible when death is near, then faithfulness becomes the central feature of care of the dying. In particular, the acknowledgement of medical limitation makes faithfulness a necessary modifier of care at the end of life. That's true for family members who may wish to still hold on. It's true of physicians. But once finitude is acknowledged both in our living toward death and in the practice of medicine, and once no more heroic medical procedures are beneficial, then faithful care is necessary, lest there be the temptation for caregivers in general and medical staff in particular, and sometimes family, to ignore or avoid or even abandon those near death. The kinds of changes that Sherwin Newland was talking about last night, the kinds of changes that need to take place in medical care, will not occur, it seems to me, until there's a shared acceptance of finitude. I've said many times, and I think it's not rational in some ways, and but I believe it, that if we could convince every mosque and every synagogue and every Christian congregation and every religious gathering under what name, and maybe even a few health clubs and fitness centers, to spend 1 month focusing on finitude. Sunday morning, Saturday evening, Friday night talks to the religious gatherings, videos showing at the health club, songs that focus on finitude. All for 1 month, we simply immerse ourselves in the reality that human beings are finite. I believe we would go a long ways in solving the healthcare crisis, because it is that deep. And for me, finitude is the broader category that I take from Becker's of the fear of death. What follows, I've already said as well, that faithfulness in care of the dying is a prelude to loving and compassionate care. And I don't need to tell you how important it is for us to be compassionate and loving, but it is important for us to show up and stay long enough for that compassion to show. So we need compassionate, loving care that listens to unspoken sadness and facilitates the process of letting go. But we need constantly to remind ourselves to show up and stay a while. So whenever we acknowledge the inescapability of finitude and the limits of medical care, whenever we agree that not everything is possible, I believe that faithfulness needs to modify care at the end of life. And there is a parallel, or there's a corollary theme to this, and that is that in order to stay present and remain faithful, we need to remind ourselves that we too are dying. That's a part of those of you who regularly work as nurses and hospice chaplains and social workers in context at the end of life are constantly reminded that the one with whom you converse, the one for whom you care, is engaged in a process that will happen to you as well.